David Aikman, author and former journalist with Time magazine. Does God exist? Does the cosmos have an all-powerful, infinitely intelligent creator? For centuries, scientists and philosophers have debated this fundamental question to no avail. But now, in this reality show about reality itself, a team of renowned explorers make a historic breakthrough. Their quest takes us from the fiery birth of the cosmos to the inexplicable genesis of life on planet Earth, and finally, the sudden appearance of self-conscious, language-using Homo sapiens. Each participant is a celebrity in his own right. Each brings a unique perspective. They are indeed some of the world's foremost authorities on the interface of science and religion. The highlight of the show is a series of astonishing pronouncements from the best-known academic atheist of the past 50 years, Professor Anthony Flew of England. Over the decades, he has published over 30 books attacking belief in God and debated a wide range of religious believers, starting with C.S. Lewis in Oxford. But in our show, Flew makes a startling turnaround. In 1950, Professor Flew set the agenda for atheism with his Theology and Falsification, a paper whose content was first presented in a debate with C.S. Lewis. This work was reportedly the most widely reprinted philosophical publication of the last half-century. Among Professor Flew's 30-plus books are The Presumption of Atheism, Atheistic Humanism, Darwinian Evolution, and A Rational Animal.
Reason, which I think Dr. Warren wished and expected. Well, let's review once more what that supporting reason is. And the first step is a matter of method, and it consists in arguing that the right starting point is what I have indeed elsewhere called the Stratonicean presumption, or the presumption of atheism.
Flew's main objections. Number one, the eternal universe.
Well, certainly I am inclined to believe that the universe was without beginning and will be without end. Indeed, I know no good reasons for disputing either of these suggestions.
Number two, life as a random process.
Certainly, I do believe that living organisms evolved over an immeasurably long period of time from non-living.
And number three, the idea that God is a self-contradiction.
I know there is no God. The second thing which I need to say is I know that people feel, not only Dr. Warren, that I've not really been offering any reasons for being an atheist. I'm afraid I think that I have. I mean, you may well think they're not good enough, but I think that I have. In the in the two things that I've been saying about the first stage in any systematic apologetic. If, after all, the things that are said about this proposed being are contradictory, then to say that there is such a being, thus and thus described, is like saying there's a round square or an unmarried husband. And if this is so, this is a frightfully good reason for saying there's no such thing. It's exactly the sort of reason we have for saying there's no such thing as a married bachelor and so on.
The subject of our show is what might be called the new story of science. The launching pad is New York University in New York City. Professor Flew is joined by Dr. Gerald Schroeder from Israel and Dr. John Haldane from Scotland. The MIT-trained Schroeder, who taught at MIT in Boston and the Weizmann Institute and the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, is the author of the bestseller The Science of God. His most recent work is The Hidden Face of God: How Science Reveals the Ultimate Truth. Haldane is Professor of Philosophy at St Andrews University, Scotland, and the author of numerous publications on science, philosophy, and religion. He delivered the Stanton Lectures at Cambridge University and was scheduled to deliver the famous Gifford Lectures in 2005. His widely publicized debate on the existence of God with J.J.C. Smart was published by Oxford University Press as Atheism and Theism. The setting for our show is the cosmos as a whole. The liftoff date is May 7th, 2004. Our explorers are the thinkers joining us here, and our journey takes us to the origins of the universe, life, and humankind. Where did the universe, the longest-running reality show, come from? How did life and reproduction and consciousness emerge? What gave rise to our minds, to our ability to conceptualize and understand and use language? Are we intruders in the universe who will be voted off or fired? Or are we meant to be here? And what does modern science tell us about all this? This reality show is truly about reality. In fact, it is about the ultimate reality, which is another name for God. Our starting point is the new story of science, the discovery of the progressive increase in the IQ of the universe. The IQ of the universe has progressed. In this chart, from the beginning of time until today, time is represented by the horizontal axis, IQ by huge steps on the vertical axis. We know today that the history of the universe is a story of quantum leaps of intelligence, the sudden yet systematic appearance of intrinsically intelligent systems arranged in an ascending order. In relatively rapid succession, we see the coming into existence of the physical universe, then of life, then of consciousness, and finally of mind. The IQ of the universe is evident all around us. The genetic code, the periodic table, relativity and quantum physics, photosynthesis and symbiosis, and innumerable laws and codes and constants form an infrastructure of intelligence supporting our everyday world. Schroeder describes findings that information is the most basic hard fact of the universe.
What we do find here is that the universe may in fact be composed of information. That is to say that this fundamental stuff of the universe is in fact information itself.
The universe had a high IQ from the beginning. Vast arrays of ingenious laws and precise mathematical constants are already in place before the birth of the cosmos. Then, some 14 billion years ago, an energy field mysteriously burst into being, generating hundreds of billions of galaxies and stars.
The fact is, if we look at the expansion of the universe, and we see that day by day the universe gets larger, and the data from the Hubble telescope and the Keck, as I mentioned before, in Hawaii give us data of the universe expanding and stretching. So if the universe is getting bigger and larger by day, the scale of the universe is the proper terminology. If we run the equation back in time, we can't go back in time physically, but mathematically we certainly can. What happens is eventually the space between all particles reduces to essentially zero. That would be the creation, the Big Bang, the creation of the universe, the moment of which our universe comes into being. So the data imply that there was a beginning to our universe. The question is what we can't see outside or before the universe, but the question would remain then, is this a willful act or not?
Around 9 billion years later, planet Earth is formed. What is puzzling at this stage is the sudden appearance of life. Dr. Schroeder thinks this is stunning.
Life starts not after billions of years, but it's geologically speaking, immediately. Now, obviously there's a slack there of several millions of years, but the oldest rocks that can bear fossils already have fossils of fully formed single-celled life. Nature invents photosynthesis in a snap and starts oxygenating the atmosphere. And the rapidity is what's the surprise.
Many of us were taught that scientists believed that life arose from a sort of primordial biological soup. Could life have risen from random reactions? The late Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA, who described himself as an agnostic inclined towards atheism, argued very clearly that the chances are so small as to be negligible that the long polymer molecules that sustain life could have been assembled by random processes from the chemical units of which they are made. Moreover, in geological terms, life appeared immediately after the Earth had cooled down. To explain this sudden emergence of living organisms, the agnostic Crick suggested that life may have been deliberately planted on Earth. Of course, in this explanation, Crick neatly avoids telling us planted by whom or what. Schroeder claims that the idea that life is a product of random reactions is no longer taken seriously by most scientists.
Harold Morowitz, in his book, Energy Flow and Biology, computed that merely to create a single bacterium would require more time than the universe might ever see. If chance, random combinations of its molecules were the only driving force, life could not have started by chance. Since 1979, you will have to search far and wide to find in a reviewed journal, in a peer-reviewed journal, an article that relates the origin of life to pure random reactions.
Some thinkers, including Stephen Hawking, have argued that a horde of monkeys typing on a computer long enough could produce one of Shakespeare's sonnets. They then apply the analogy to claim that life could have originated from random reactions given enough time.
The New Yorker, in the Christmas New Year issue of 2002, going on to 2003, was so impressed by the likelihood that this could happen that in fact it devoted its cover to the monkeys producing one of Shakespeare's sonnets. And you see the monkeys here hammering away, bing, bing, this one's not too happy, this one's really unhappy. But then over here in the corner, you get a real happy monkey. He got it. He got the sonnet. Now, it's interesting to go through the numbers to see how that works, but it's so accepted that a year or so, well, the Times of London, Friday, the 9th of May, 2003, it has an article, Much Ado, but monkeys fail the Shakespeare's test. Monkeys failed, so what's the much ado? The National Council of Arts was convinced to give a 2,000 pound sterling Arts Council sponsorship to a project in which a computer would be placed in a monkey cage with 6 monkeys. Okay, you got to get this. So they get this. They put the keyboard. I don't think they put the whole computer in because that'd be too dangerous. They probably put the keyboard in and shielded the wires and had the wire to go out of the cage into where the readout would be. It stayed in there for a month. They produced about 50 pages of hammering away. But the article is very interesting because the person, this woman that was in charge of the article when writing this up for the interview, said it was quite amazing and quite disgusting, in fact, how the experiment worked. First of all, when the monkeys were confronted by the computer, they tried to eat it. Then that didn't work, so they used it as a toilet, which she said was a real problem because she was the one in charge of cleaning up the mess afterwards. But they produced 50 pages without a single word. Without a single word present of all this typing. So how can that be? I mean, how can it possibly be? I mean, the shortest word in the English language is one letter. So they must have hit an A or an I, even if it wasn't capitalized, from time to time. But of course, that wouldn't be a word, would it? Supposing you have Z, Q, W, A, V, W, the A isn't a word. What you have to have for the word to be randomly produced is spacebar, A, spacebar. In other words, even a one-letter word requires 3 acts in sequence: space, A, space, to isolate the A from the other lines of gibberish that are coming out. If you think there were, let's say, 30, 25, probably about 30, 35 key positions on the computer, probably more, but just pulling a number 30 out of the air, the 26 languages plus space bars plus the @ symbol, the number, let's say 30 or possibly closer to 40. Well, the likelihood of getting that letter then is 30 times 30 times 30. Well, 30 times 30 is 900 times another 30 is 27,000. The likelihood of getting a one-letter word by random typing is 1 chance out of 27,000. What's the likelihood of getting a Shakespeare sonnet? Now, I wouldn't use this as a parallel for life, but that's what we get out of the most widely sold science book ever written, The Brief History of Time. What's the likelihood of getting a Shakespeare sonnet by hammering away? Well, I went to MIT, so I'm not supposed to know too much about sonnets, and I don't, but I knew enough to learn where to look. Shakespeare's complete works. All the sonnets are the same length. They're by definition 14 lines long. I picked the one that I knew the opening line for. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day or evening? I don't even know. In any event, I counted the number of letters. There are 488 letters in that sonnet. 488 letters. What's the likelihood, forgetting spaces, what's the likelihood of hammering away and getting 488 letters in the exact sequence that shall I compare thee to a summer's eve? And then going on through this. Well, the likelihood of, let's say it's S-H-A-L-L. So if you had a bag with 26 letters in it, you reach in and you want to pull out an S, the likelihood is 1 chance out of 26. If you have 2 bags, each with 26 letters, and I want to get S-H because I'm going to S-H-A-L-L, shall, 26, 1 out of 26 for the first bag, 1 out of 26 for the second, so that's 26 times 26. The A, 1 out of 26, keep adding. What you end up is 26 multiplied by itself 488 times. Or, in other words, 26 to the 488th power. Or, in other words, in base 10, 10 to the 690th. The number of particles in the universe, not grains of sand, I mean particles of protons, neutrons, electrons, muons, is about 10 to the 80th. We're talking about 10 to the 600th. That's 10 to the 80th is 1 with 80 zeros after it. 10 to the 690th is 1 with 690 zeros after it. There's not enough particles in the universe to write down all the trials. You'd be off by a factor of 10 to the 600th. If you took the entire universe and converted it to computer chips, the universe weighs approximately 10 to the 55th grams mass energy. So 10 to the 55th, 10 to the 56th. So we'll take 100 universes, 1,000 universes, 10 to the 60th. Huge, ultra massive universe, which cannot be that heavy, because it would have collapsed on itself immediately. And turn that entire universe, not just the Earth, the entire universe, forget the monkeys, into computer chips, each one weighing 1/1,000,000th of a gram. And have each computer chip able to spin out 488 trials, let's say, 1,000,000 times a second, which is about the speed, because eventually you get the problem of just transferring of information to run this out. If you turn the entire computer chip universe into these microcomputer chips, and the computer chips were spinning 1,000,000 times a second, a sonnet, but random letters, the number of trials you would get since the beginning of time would be 10 to the 90th trials. It's off again by a factor of 10 to the 600th. You will never get a sonnet by chance. The unit would have to be 10 to the 600th times larger. That's a billion until you get to the 600 times larger, or older by 10 to the billion. It doesn't happen. Yet the world just thinks, what's the problem? We'll get the universe. We'll get the monkeys can do it every time.
Schroeder emphasizes the point that we know when life arose, but not how.
The universe is tuned for life, not tuned for the starting of life. That's not at all clear. We don't have any idea at the moment how life started. Speculations yet, yes, but how inert matter became alive, that's a complete unknown at the moment. However, once life gets started, we see clearly from the fundamental constants of the universe that, in fact, the universe is tuned for life.
Every living being, from the first bacterium to the largest dinosaur, is an autonomous agent that generates energy, reproduces and processes information using an incredibly intelligent symbol processing system, DNA. Life is a manifestation of intelligence written in the language of DNA. DNA is the computer software that constructs and maintains cells, determines the sequence of amino acids in every protein, and contains the genetic information transmitted to future generations. DNA is transcribed into RNA. RNA is translated into proteins. Proteins are just as fascinating as DNA. Proteins have the extraordinary ability to assemble themselves without external intervention. Every cell in the body, other than sex and blood cells, makes 2,000 proteins every second from hundreds of amino acids. To repeat, this happens every second. But this process is so complex, says Scientific American, that a supercomputer programmed with the rules for protein folding would take 10 to the power of 127 years to generate the final folded form of a single protein with just 100 amino acids. And yet, what takes a supercomputer trillions of years takes seconds for real proteins. Note that life was fully formed when it first appeared, with all its essential properties, from DNA and proteins to replication. What about the origin of species?
For 3 billion years, life remained single-celled, and then out of the blue comes what's called the Cambrian explosion. This is Time magazine. Scientific American talks about it also in the terminology, the Big Bang of animal evolution. The Big Bang of animal evolution is quite amazing. It's described quite succinctly in Scientific American that every phylum that exists today came into being simultaneously. There are approximately 34 animal phyla. All of those 34 appear in the fossil record in a strata called the Cambrian explosion. Simply, here's Chordacta. That's our first formation in our phylum. It's primitive fish. These are the first insects, the trilobites, and they are mollusks, and all together, all the 34 appear out of the blue. 3.8 billion years ago, 3.6, 3.7 approximately, 3.8 billion years ago, water forms, life begins. For 3 billion years, life remains one-celled. Then out of the blue, the Cambrian explosion produces this menagerie of life.
It is not simply the simultaneous appearance of all the animal body plans that is striking. Suddenly, the most basic form of consciousness, eyesight, visual consciousness, emerges across the board.
In that life, already are eyes. Every phylum that has eyes today appeared in the fossil record for the first time with eyes.
In seeing, a mechanical stimulus is transformed into a nerve signal that is sent to the brain and then converted into a conscious state. Despite decades of scientific study, the bridge between these two worlds, the external stimulus and the corresponding sense perception, remains as much a mystery today as ever. The philosopher Karl Popper noted that the emergence of consciousness in the animal kingdom is perhaps as great a mystery as the origin of life. A central mystery in origin of life studies is the origin of reproduction. In his book, What Remains to be Discovered, Sir John Maddox, the editor emeritus of the journal Nature, noted, "The overriding question is when and how sexual reproduction itself evolved. Despite decades of speculation, we do not know." And yet, reproduction is almost always overlooked in origin discussions. But in this show, it is a key part of the plot.
Because what we've got to try to explain is how it is we get from inanimate, lifeless matter, which does not reproduce itself, to a situation of entities that do. Because reproduction brings onto the scene something that wasn't there before. Well, what they're going to have to try to do is say that what preceded reproduction was sufficient, was enough to get reproduction going, but wasn't itself reproduction. Because of course, if it was itself reproduction, then we've just pushed the question one stage back. We're back to that old regress problem. We're trying to explain the origins of reproduction, and so we can't explain the origins of reproduction in terms of things that are already reproducing. So what people will start to say are things like this: well, we've got maybe proto-reproduction. That is to say, we've got certain chemical physical reactions that are not themselves reproductive, but they're on their way to being reproductive. But this really isn't an explanation, it's just a cheat. The fact of the matter is, either we've got reproduction or we haven't got reproduction. If we have reproduction, we don't seem to be able to explain it out of something that isn't already reproducing. And if we have reproduction already, then we haven't yet explained it.
The very first forms of life that reach us today already had to have the ability of reproduction. Mm-hmm. Reproduction is purpose-driven. Reproduction isn't casual. The idea of reproduction, the purpose-driven of preserving the species and moving it forward. Mm-hmm. So already these forms of life had purpose behind them, which indicates something fairly significant. So why would early life even have considered, as it was in quotes, considered reproduction? If you didn't know you were going to die, why bother worried about reproduction? Humans happen to know that at the end of this chapter, there's an end. It's called death. That may not be the end of life, but death is the end of the chapter of this aspect of life. Well, why would the early first forms of life have thought of this? I mean, did they know they were going to die? Did a bacterium know it was going to die?
Finally, our journey brings us to ourselves, the new race of self-conscious language users. The next origin question is so ingrained in our daily lives that we never give it a second thought. Consider what you've been doing up to this point. You've been watching this program and its participants and weighing their arguments. They've been talking to you with certain codes we call language, and you've been decoding their linguistic symbols to understand what they are trying to say. So we ask, how did language arise, and how did we acquire the capacity to use it? The atheist evolutionist Richard Dawkins says quite bluntly, there doesn't seem to be anything like syntax in non-human animals, and it is hard to imagine evolutionary forerunners of it. Equally obscure is the origin of semantics, of words and their meanings. Further, we ask, who does the understanding when we hear someone? Is it your brain cells, or is it you? And where are you located? In some part of your brain, or elsewhere in your body? Harvard brain scientist Steven Pinker said in How the Mind Works, the I is not a combination of body parts or brain states or bits of information, but a unity of selfness over time, a single locus that is nowhere in particular. How did language and conceptual thought arise? Language is a system of codes that conveys meaning through symbols. The activities of coding and decoding, of seeing meaning, are irreducibly immaterial. Syntactical language is unique to human beings, found even in ancient civilizations and instinctively mastered by children at a very young age. But scientists cannot explain the origin of language or the jump from primitive to syntactical language.
The nature of language as the expression of conceptual thought calls for an explanation that is ultimately only going to be available if there is an intrinsic source of mindedness that, in creating beings, communicates that ability, that intellectual ability or power to those beings.
So, how do we account for the IQ of the universe? Many of the greatest scientists of all time, from Newton to Einstein to Heisenberg, found it inconceivable that a purely material matrix, formless and randomized, can generate undeniable intelligence. In their view, the intelligence of the universe, its laws, points to an intelligence that has no limitation, a superior mind, as Einstein put it.
Certain it is a conviction, akin to a religious feeling, of the rationality or intelligibility of the world lies behind all scientific work of a higher order. This firm belief, a belief bound up with a deep feeling and a superior mind that reveals itself in the world of experience, represents my conception of God.
As they saw it, only an infinitely intelligent mind, the mind of God, can serve as a source of energy, life, consciousness, and rationality, and the laws of nature. Underlying the IQ of the universe is the God matrix. This was for them the summit of scientific discovery. In other words, of all the great discoveries of modern science, the greatest is God. Now, of course, this is not a conviction shared by all scientists and philosophers, and certainly there are obstacles facing the God hypothesis, the existence of evil and imperfection, for instance. Many people assume that intelligence in the universe somehow evolved out of non-intelligence, given chance and enough time, and in the case of living beings, through a natural selection and random mutation. But even in the most hard-headed and materialistic scenario, intelligence and intelligence systems come fully formed from day one. Matter, mass energy, came with all its intricate, ingenious, mathematically precise laws from the time it first appeared. Life came fully formed with the incredibly intelligent symbol processing of DNA, the astonishing phenomenon of protein folding, and the marvel of replication from its very first appearance. Language, the incarnation of conceptual thought with its inexplicable structure of syntax, symbols, and semantics, appeared out of the blue, again with its essential infrastructure as is from day one. The evidence we have shows unmistakably that there was no progressive, gradual evolution of non-intelligence into intelligence in any of the fundamental categories of energy, life, or mind. Each one of the three had intrinsically intelligent structures from the time each first appeared. Each, it would seem, proceeds from an infinitely intelligent mind in a precise sequence. This is the conclusion to which the origin events point.
3 points that merit attention. First of all, the transition from inanimate matter, lifeless matter, to life. Secondly, the movement from life as such up to the level of sentient or conscious life, the kind of state of existence that's enjoyed both by animals and by human beings. But then thirdly, the higher level of existence, intellectual existence, that's exhibited by human beings when, for example, they do such things as engage in talking about philosophy and science.
In an effort to avoid the obvious answer that the source of life, consciousness and thought has to be living, conscious and thinking, some thinkers simply point to a mysterious phenomenon called emergence. But this attempt simply misses the whole point.
What some people have wanted to say is this: well, over the history of the universe, what's happened is that when matter gets to a certain level of complexity, there emerges this a further level. So matter becomes organized in certain ways, and then that leads to life. Life pops up, as it were, gets added to the stack, and then when life, biological properties, reach a certain level of complexity, then consciousness arises up out of that, and then again, at a certain level of complexity, consciousness gives rise to intellect. But these metaphors of giving rise to, or of emerging out of, or producing and so on, aren't really an explanation. They're just a description of the thing that needs to be explained.
So, what does Antony Flew think of the new story of science? This will be our concern in the next segment. Let's return to Flew's main objections. Number 1, the eternal universe. Number 2, life as a random process. And number 3, the idea that God is a self-contradiction.
My point is that all questions about the truth of Dr. Warren's system and all questions about the truth of any of the innumerable rival accounts of powers and purposes behind and above the universe should start with the presumption of atheism. And the presumption of atheism, like the presumption of innocence in the British common law, concerns the burden of proof. It's not an assumption that something is the case, it's a thesis about the burden of proof. It is the claim that if we are rationally to proceed above and behind the universe to some story about the supernatural and the transcendent, then we need to have some positive good reason to believe in this story. If we're going to go behind and beyond what's common to all sensible people of any religion or of none, then we need some good reason for making whatever bold conjecture it is proposed that we should make.
What does he think today of the origin of the universe?
The Big Bang Theory relate to such an existence of ordered intelligence in the world?
Where I and my lot do differ from all the others is that we reject the whole idea of any transcendent reality behind or above the universe. We start and stop with what is common to all men of all religions and none. That is to say, we start and stop with the universe itself, with the everyday world of common sense and common experience, and with those hidden mechanisms of that world which are progressively revealed by the advance of science. And we reject all transcendent supernatural systems, not because we've examined or could have examined each in turn, but because it does not seem to us that there is any good evidencing reason to postulate anything behind or beyond this natural universe.
When I first met the Big Bang theory as an unbeliever, it seemed to me this made a big difference because this did at least suggest that the universe had a beginning, and hence that the first sentence in the book of Genesis is related to an event in the universe. You know, if there had been no reason to think that the universe had a beginning, there would have been no need to postulate something else which produced the whole thing. But because it had a beginning, the question of what produced this beginning becomes an entirely sensible and almost inevitable one to ask. So that very greatly changed the situation from the one which I was confronted with in the 1930s or 40s and 50s.
What happened before the Big Bang? Some cosmologists today speculate that our universe may be one of numerous other universes. But this doesn't solve the problem, as Flew points out.
Because if the existence of one universe requires explanation, the existence of a multiplicity of universes requires a much bigger explanation. The problem has increased by a factor of whatever is the total number of universes.
What about Flew's views on the origin of life?
Matter. Well, yes, certainly. I do believe that living organisms evolved over an immeasurably long period of time from non-living. And let's take some examples. Let's consider the inordinate complexity of the human eye, and then say, who made it all? Well, if you just consider the most obviously available evidence, the answer is no one made it, it growed. About the reproductive system, I'm a bit surprised to find Dr. Warren talking about the human reproductive system. I know it's all a bit fashionable in the presidential debates and all that, but after all, the human reproductive system is not the right thing to refer to if you want to say men, so to speak, couldn't appear without special creation. It's to refer to the way in which we all know that human beings do appear. And if special creation involved, it was a long time ago. But, immediately human beings appear in a way that's all too familiar and which we describe as the facts of life.
Professor Flew, in your view, does modern science indicate the existence of an outside intelligent, active in this universe?
Yes, I now think it does, almost entirely because of the DNA investigations. What I think that the DNA material has done has shown by its almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which lead to produce this being, that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinarily diverse elements to work together. It's an enormous complexity of the number of elements, but an enormous subtlety of the ways they work together. It's only, the chance of them meeting the two parts at the right time is simply minute. That's the best I can do for a short explanation. It is all, in my view, a matter of the enormous complexity by which the results are achieved, which look to me like the work of intelligence.
Professor Flew agrees that reproduction poses a problem.
I don't know that anyone has offered any sort of theory, a virtually insoluble problem, which, of course, makes it suitable material for an argument to design.
Those who argue that life originated from random reactions sometimes use the analogy of monkeys typing on a computer. Flew is not impressed with this argument.
But I think you have very, very satisfactorily and decisively established that the what we might call the monkey theorem is a load of rubbish. I mean, it's particularly good to do it with just a mere sonnet. And if it's absolutely absurd for that, then a more elaborate feat to be achieved by chance is simply, it's absurd to suggest it.
The sudden appearance of different forms of life is also puzzling.
Of one of the articles in the journal Science, many articles like this. This is from 1995 by Robert Kerr. Did Darwin get it all right? Now, I never thought I would see in the peer-reviewed, extraordinarily highly respected journal Science, and then the subtitle is subtitle is no, that species appear with a highly un-Darwinian-like rapidity. That's the journal Science, peer-reviewed. And that's the basic problem, isn't it, Professor Flew?
Yeah.
That suddenly you have these explosions of life, and they seem to come literally out of the blue.
Flew agrees that the origin questions lead to the idea of an intelligent mind at work in the universe.
Reflecting upon what is known and studied in science and so on does drive the mind in the direction, well, as I say, either of saying, well, we simply can't explain it, there is no explanation, all these discontinuous changes, there's no explanation, or there is an explanation, purposeful agency. I don't know whether or not what Anthony feels about that.
Well, it is very difficult to avoid this conclusion, I think.
Number 3. We come now to the question of the nature of God. In the past, Flew said that the idea of God as omnipresent spirit makes no sense.
Now, someone says that they believe that there is a being, all-powerful and so on, personal and so on. And of course, this being is immeasurably greater than human beings, and of course, it's incorporeal. Well now, how do we point out, how do we pick out as a subject of discourse the object that we are saying has these characteristics? One way, of course, of doing it would be to say, oh well, of course, these characteristics, infinite power and so on, do not belong to any particular thing in the universe. We're not saying that something over there has all these. This would be ridiculous. Of course, we're not saying that. We're really saying it about the whole universe. But now, this move, which has been made by some, is clearly unacceptable to Christians, because this is a pantheist move. So one says, oh well, we're not saying this about any particular thing in the universe or about the universe as a whole. We're saying it about something outside the universe. Well, yes, I can see what's being said about something. My difficulty is to see to what I've got to attach these remarks as the subject. What are these things being said about? I mean, it's all very well saying, oh well, they're being said about God. Yes, well, of course, one knew that, but how does one pick out this subject, indicate what it is to about which one's wanting to say the various things?
What does Flew now think of the idea that God is self-contradictory?
I think that perhaps a way of approaching this would be to think about what we mean when we say that somebody has effects. I mean, it might be said, for example, of a major American corporation that their influence reaches throughout the world.
Yeah.
Now, I think you would have to be naive to suppose that what that meant was that somehow, literally, there was extending out from the headquarters in New York or something of that sort, these sort of tentacles. What we would mean when we said that their influence reached out throughout the world was that those people in that office in New York, let's say, could bring about effects throughout the world. They could, for example, by investing in shares or divesting of shares, have effects on the economy of remote parts of the world. So what we're really saying is that they're present, their influence is present, not by their being there, but by their effects being there. So the understanding of God's omnipresence, it seems to me, should be given in the following way, that to say that God is omnipresent throughout nature is not to say that God is spatially present throughout nature, but to say there is no part of the cosmos that is beyond God's influence, that God's effects are everywhere in the cosmos. Now, I don't know, does that help at all?
I think it does extremely well, yes. Yes, I think that.
Some success there.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, yes.
Flew makes a significant admission that the existence of evil does not disprove the existence of God.
I'm not sure that either party should make the whole question of the existence of God depend on this unwarranted or warranted evil.
According to Schroeder, nature, in fact, gives some indication of God's interest in us. Author Roy Varghese joins the panel.
Yeah. God then is interested enough in the universe, having wound up the energy forces, then to force that to become alive. So there's a step further, suddenly we have an involvement in this creator beyond the Big Bang creation. You could say, well, we've been running on the energy for the last 15 billion years of one puff called the Big Bang, and that's it. But when we see this type of emergence, that the graphite and the paper comes together and somehow etching the outline for a drawing appears, then something is present in the universe that goes beyond the creation. And then that possibly makes it more difficult to have the concept of an uninterested God. Because first you get the idea, God can just run the universe, puts the universe online, it goes, then steps back. Then suddenly we find this great, tremendous problem of getting life and reproduction. So you say, okay, so God had the interest in starting the universe, and now God, for some reason, has an interest in starting life within the universe. So now we've got God further downstream in the universe and more intimately involved. It becomes more difficult to extract that concept now from God being active in the life it created. Because God, if you take life as being an emergent property that would not be predicted by looking at the properties of protons, neutrons, and electrons, which you wouldn't. Yet one mixture gives you a grain of sand, and the other gives you a mixture. The identical protons and neutrons give you the brain of an Einstein, and one gives you a lump of sand. So clearly there is this emergent reality. So now you've gotten God so intimately connected with the universe, having, let's say, started life, even if it's just bacteria, but it becomes hard to see how it goes beyond just simple life. Well, now we know that God's interested in the universe beyond just winding it up. So now the fingerprint is there. Does that imply almost a necessity to assume then that God is actually interested in the life that it made? Clearly, this thing we call God was interested in the universe enough to make it become alive. Now is that the end? Or can we take that step, which demonstrates an interest beyond just making the universe, and then almost force us to say, well, now, having started life, now God is interested in that life? I mean, God, some enervating force was interested enough to get reproductive organisms to come to be, which you'd never predict from protons, neutrons, and electrons, let alone light beams. But that is what happened. So can we always force the understanding of another step beyond that then God is interested in is the origin of life a form of self-revelation?
Oh, I see this as a powerful argument. I don't see any way to meet that argument at the moment.
Science cannot tell us about the God of faith, but our concern in this show is the IQ of the universe and what this tells us about its origin. On this matter, our journey has finally reached a destination. The stars of our show have reached a consensus with the pioneers of modern science. Our smart universe manifests an infinite intelligence, an ultimate reality. In fact, the greatest discovery of modern science is God. And this is David Aikman. The Wonder of the World, A Journey from Modern Science to the Mind of God by Roy Abraham Varghese, is the companion volume to Has Science Discovered God? Wonder is a dialogue between an atheist scientist and a theistic thinker on the existence of God, and has been endorsed by Nobel Prize winners and other noted scholars, including Professor Anthony Flew, who remarked that I was hugely impressed and substantially challenged by it. In Wonder, you will find a comprehensive overview of these origin questions, the science-religion insights of great scientists, and the thesis that the God equation underlies modern science. Varghese was previously co-editor of Cosmos, Bios, Theos, a work described in Time magazine as, quote, the year's most intriguing book about God, unquote.